On to. So now I'm excited to introduce you to our keynote speaker this morning. Our keynote sponsor is Manulife, so thanks to them. And today we brought you a keynote speaker all the way from San Francisco. Angie Jones has had a super busy year speaking and presenting workshops literally all over the world. And we're really happy that she could make time to come and see us here in Kitchener-Waterloo. So today she's going to talk to us a bit about owning our own narrative as testers, and I'm really interested to hear what she has to say on that, so I'll call her up now. Thanks.
Take a journey with me as we explore the history of the music industry. Back before 1877, the only way that you could listen to music was to hear it live. That was before Thomas Edison invented the phonograph. This was a revolutionary invention that would allow for the recording of audio and also its playback. It was very simple, yet ingenious. The way it worked was a machine had a needle, and the vibrations from the sound would move that needle to inscribe the sound into tin foil. And then the machine could play back that tin foil and reproduce the sound. So Thomas Edison, much like us testers, he began to think of all of the possible scenarios he could use this for. Perhaps to record someone's last dying wishes, or maybe a voice recorder for office dictation. But he predicted that its main use case would be to play back musical performance. And he was right. Musicians, they love the idea of having their songs immortalized. And listeners love the concept of being able to replay their favorite songs. So it was really great to have these musical recordings. However, there was only one copy of it. And so there became a need to be able to replicate this. So they made enhancements to the phonograph so that they no longer were writing just to tin foil, but could write onto wax. And this is where the term cutting a record came from. And so with this, they introduced a new business model. Now, musicians, they had to make some adjustments for this new medium. As opposed to performing on stage all the time, now they had to go into these small rooms and perform in front of this machine, essentially in front of the horn. And if there were a lot of them in the band, they would need to pile together and kind of make it work. The adjustments they need to make, the machine didn't necessarily pick up highs and lows very well. Sounded awful. Things like the bass drum, if you tried to play it back. And so they had to trade that out for cowbell, for example. If someone wanted to sing a really low passage, then they would have to put their face right inside of the machine in order to have it pick it up. If someone wanted to sing a really high note, they would have to back away or risk the needle jumping out of the groove. When performing live on stage, they wanted to make sure that their audience got their money's worth. So it wasn't uncommon to compose a song that would last up to an hour. But that wouldn't work with this new format because it could only hold but so much data. So they had to condense their song into 2 to 3 minutes. But still, it needed to be something that was impactful and just as good as if they were playing live, because now they needed to sell these. Another thing that changed. On stage, if you messed up, if you mispronounced the syllable, no big deal. If you were playing an instrument and you accidentally hit 2 strings when you meant to hit 1, not a big deal. Okay.
Just leave that on, and I'll turn it off there.
All right. All right. I'll wait for this. Better? All right, cool. All right. So, yeah, they needed to basically perform really well if they were going to do it for the machine, because it was recording them and actually writing to the record. And so there was no room for mistakes or errors. And things like stage presence and charisma became much less important. And they had to focus more on efficiency and being able to do a nice, clean take. On stage, they could interact with the audience and kind of feed off of the audience's energy. And that's really important to musicians. But in this room, they didn't have that aspect. And so they needed to still be able to perform top quality stuff without that. So there were definitely some adjustments there. With people now being able to buy their own copies of music, they also began to develop preferences. So someone might like opera music, whereas someone else in their home, a spouse maybe, might enjoy country music. And that was okay because now we can buy our own copies. Before, with live music, no one really cared who was playing. It was such a social activity. We just all wanted to go out and listen to music together. But now this became a much more personal activity where people would retreat to their rooms and close the door and kind of zone out on music. Now, while this was cool for the listeners, venues like nightclubs didn't necessarily like this so much because they were in the business of profiting off of people coming out and listening to music. So they further enhanced the phonograph to make it coin operated. And today this is known as the jukebox. People loved the jukebox. They were fascinated by this. What? I drop a nickel in and I can hear a song? Amazing. So these became more popular and seen more frequently in the nightclubs. And the nightclubs realized, hey, these are more popular than actually having a live musician come in. Maybe we'll scale back on how often we pay someone to come and perform when we already invested in this machine. Musicians didn't necessarily like this because what they had done is essentially found a way to automate entertainment. People loved automation. It was fascinating. They started finding new ways to automate things, such as this player piano, which didn't even require a human to play it. Those jukeboxes, they started showing up not just nightclubs, but in diners and other venues. Everyone loved it, except the musicians, of course. And then in 1920, a new medium came on the scene, commercial radio. Before this time, if you wanted to listen to music, you had to pay for it. Either you were going to pay for a live performance, you were going to buy a record, or you were going to put money into the coin machine. But now, they'd introduced a way to listen to hit songs without paying anything. Advertisers were footing the bill now. And this became so popular, within 2 years, there were 500 of these radio stations that popped up all over the U.S. Musicians, they tried to fight against this, tried to resist it, because the radio stations were legally, they weren't obligated to pay the musicians any royalty. So there wasn't much gain in it for the musicians. Record sales during that time began to decline drastically. Because why do I need to buy the record when I can hear it for free on the radio? And so musicians, they fought against this for some time, but it would take decades before they were actually able to be paid what they deserved. And so they decided to use another technique to fight back: quality. And they started recording using a new approach: electronic recording. And this sounded so much better than the radio. It even sounded better than the records they'd recorded before. This technique was so good that they could bring back those old instruments that they'd gotten rid of, like the bass drum. And so people began to buy records again. That was until the Great Depression. So during this time, we had the stock market crash. We had several people who were out of work. And so things like buying records became a luxury that people simply could not afford. They leaned on those automated machines because the nightclubs were struggling as well. People weren't coming out like they used to. And so they looked at ways that they could further improve upon the jukebox. Whereas before, you would put your coin in and it might play one song. There were a couple of fancy ones that would rotate through a few songs. But they fixed it such that I could put in my coin and now I could choose which song I wanted to hear. Fancy, right? So again, people thought, oh, wow, that's really cool. They started to go out a little bit more. The musicians, again, were feeling left out. Of course, they couldn't really afford to bring them out even the few times that they were doing so before, the venues. They couldn't afford these musicians. And so they felt sorry for themselves for a little while. But then they got smart. You see, the labels, they also couldn't afford to do very heavy promotion of records during this time. So they said, you know what? How can we use those automated machines for our gain? How about we send out a song, have it play in the jukebox, and let that serve as a sample where people could hear a musician's song and think to themselves, wow, I want to go buy the whole record. And that worked. That, coupled with the enhanced technology of recording records in the end of the Great Depression, music sales were up again. Until the cassette tape. So if you wanted to listen to music on demand, you bought the record. It was that simple. But now with the cassette tape, along with radio, listeners could wait for their favorite songs and record it themselves. They no longer necessarily needed those fancy recording machines. And the players were much cheaper than trying to get a record player. So this became the new thing, the big hit. And with this do-it-yourself era, we saw more bootlegging, things like that. So again, record sales declined. And then Sony came out with the Walkman. So now this cassette became the only format that you could listen to at home, in the car, or even walking down the street. And then the CD came out. Yet again, an improvement on the recording technology. These sounded amazing. Much better than the cassettes, much better than the radio, much better than the records. And so this surpassed sales of those mediums. So much so that people thought, oh, this is it. It can't get any better than this. And then the internet made a splash. And with the internet came MP3s. With MP3s, now people weren't necessarily buying entire albums anymore. They could buy individual songs. And they no longer had to own a physical copy to hear their music. Now with this change, something really interesting happened. Musicians might not have been selling tons of albums. For example, maybe I sell 500,000. But I have a hit song on there that sold 6 million, multi-platinum. Yet we weren't tracking for that. That's not the way we counted success. And so they had to reevaluate this to determine what are some new ways that we can determine if a musician is successful. As musicians began to feel kind of left out of this whole process and taken advantage of, they used this new platform, the internet, to become closer to their customers, to directly communicate with them, to listen and see what their needs are, to build their fan base. We saw artists such as Prince, who could launch his own website and sell music directly to his listeners. In today's time, we see musicians such as Beyonce, who bypass the path that's been laid out that dictates how to be a successful musician. She didn't go through all of the channels of promoting and playing on the radio and interviews. She decided, you know what? I'm just going to surprise my listeners with a new album, and I'll put it on social media. Fastest selling album of all time. Musicians such as Jay-Z bought streaming services to say, you know what, we're not getting our just pay as musicians, and I want to change that. and allow musicians to get a greater portion of the profits. What these musicians essentially did was found a way to shift left and interact directly with their customers and own their narrative. So the music industry went through a lot of changes, a lot of ups and downs, a lot of fails, a lot of successes, a lot of facelifts. But there was one constant through it all: the role of the musician. You see, the musician's role is simply to provide entertainment to their listeners via music. It's that simple. So when they went from performing live to those small rooms without the audience feedback, their environment changed, but their role remained the same. When they had to let go of the instruments that they were skilled at because they didn't sound so great in this new environment, trading out the bass drum for the cowbell, their tools changed, but their role remained the same. When they no longer had an hour to compose this magical song, their role remained the same. When they were fighting for their respect and their just due, their role remained the same. And what's interesting about this is that anytime they resisted the changes that were brought before them, they failed. But when they not only embraced these changes, but found ways to make the changes work for them, they soared. So what's our role as testers? Dale Emery and Elizabeth Hendrickson defined this as a process of gathering information by making observations and comparing them to expectations. So as we shift left, the way that we gather information may change. The places where we make our observations, they might change. The sources of our expectations could very well change. But fundamentally, this is our role. So how do we perform this role no matter what stage we're being asked to perform it on? It could be very difficult. It could be tricky, especially when we have industry leaders who make bold statements such as testing is dead. Or when we see job wreck after job wreck calling for skills that we don't necessarily have. Or when the powers that be, who barely understand testing, try to dictate to us how to best perform our roles. But the very nature of our role requires us to question things that are brought before us and determine if they best meet the expectations of software delivery. Now, as you challenge these things, don't make the same mistakes that the musicians did. They resisted as opposed to embracing. So let's look at some of the lessons that we learned from the music industry and see how they apply to testing. Lesson 1. Make automation work for you. As testers, I hear a lot of concern about people's obsession with automation. Much like the musicians were concerned when everyone was obsessing over these jukeboxes. And rightfully so. They essentially were being automated out of their jobs. But as they resisted and fought against automation, that didn't get them anywhere. It was there to stay then, and I think it's here to stay now. When they embraced automation and say, you know what? We can use it as a sampling station. We don't give them the whole thing. Give them a sample. They have to come back to us for the bigger picture. As an automation engineer, I can confidently stand before you and say that I cannot automate a tester out of a job. There's only so much that my script can tell. I need the tester to give the bigger picture. So, how do we embrace this? How do we embrace automation? I don't think it's by all of us becoming automation engineers. We don't all need to be heads down coding. Someone needs to be looking up so that they have that clear view of the bigger picture, so that they are able to tell that bigger story. But there are things that we can do. Maybe triaging the automation execution, looking for patterns in the failures, determining if it's giving you an indication of additional places where exploration is needed. You know, I worked on a machine learning application once. And my task was to automate some tests for it. We didn't have a tester. And as I attempted to do this, it became painfully obvious to me that I couldn't do this full job with automation alone. It required some deep testing, some very thoughtful insights. And so I had to step outside of my comfort zone as an automation engineer and become a better tester. And I see this a lot in these future trends of testing, where won't just be automation. We need some thinkers, some doers, some human insight. But we also still need automation. So on that project, I needed to train the system, for example. And to do that, I had to make thousands of transactions. This wasn't something that I wanted to do by hand. Automation became a tool at that point. Observing the records at the end. Did the system actually learn? Wasn't something that I could sit as a tester in one setting and say, yep, it learned. I had to exercise this again with thousands of queries. Again, using automation and making it work for me. Lesson 2. Our tools can't always shift with us. The musicians, they had to get rid of the instruments that didn't necessarily play well. in their new environments. I see a lot of testers who are used to doing things a certain way, and they've been doing it that way for 20 years. And so as they're being asked to shift left, they're bringing all of that right along with them. The same mindsets, the same processes, the same tools. Some of these things do not translate well as we shift left. I had a company once that I worked with. They wanted to become an agile shop. And so they sent everyone out for this agile training. They brought in a coach, and for a couple of days, they received training on agile practices and methodology and how to better collaborate and all that good stuff. They came back and they put it into motion. And they were making some progress, but they saw that, you know what, testing is still kind of lagging behind. And so they called me in and said, Angie, can you please look at our process and see if you can figure out why is testing the bottleneck? So I observed this. And while there were some changes that the team could make collectively, there were definitely some things that were within the power of the testers, such as the tooling they were using. They were gung-ho on using the same test case management system that didn't really necessarily lend themselves well to an agile process. They had spreadsheets everywhere. Everything was going in a spreadsheet. People didn't necessarily want to collaborate with a bunch of spreadsheets. Some of the ways they were doing things, the way they were documenting test cases, for example, long and drawn out, weren't necessarily favorable in this new context. So I made some recommendations and said, you know, maybe you should try using some of these other tools and letting some of this stuff go. And they did. And guess what? Things began to improve almost instantly. So sometimes we have to trade in our drums for cowbell. Lesson 3. Shifting imposes limitations. So the musicians, they had this shorter duration, right, to create their masterpieces. And some of them struggled with that. We have a similar restraint on us, where we don't have 3 weeks to a month to test something anymore. We have a couple of days, maybe, and as we move more towards continuous integration, that becomes more like hours, minutes. How do we deal with that? The other restriction they had was their unfamiliar environments. So no longer being able to feel the vibe of the crowd or have that stage presence that they were used to. And yet still had to create something that was as good, if not better, in terms of quality. For us, we're in a lot of unfamiliar environments. We're being invited to all types of meetings that might be uncomfortable for us. We're going into development meetings and they're doing deep technical talks that sometimes could feel intimidating. Or we're going into product meetings where they're talking long-term vision and strategy. And we're not really sure how to contribute to this conversation. As an automation engineer, sometimes I work on teams where I need to produce in sprint automation. Testing in sprint is difficult enough, but then they want the automation as well. And what I've learned is I can utilize those unfamiliar settings and carve out a portion of those meetings to get what I need. And in turn, it helps everyone out. For example, if I go into a development meeting, I say, you know what? That sounds great. Hey, how about get on the whiteboard, draw it out for me. I want to see exactly what it's going to look like. It helps me because I want to leave that room. I don't have a lot of time. I want to leave that room and be able to go in code just like they're going to leave and go in code. And I want to do this in parallel. But to do that, I need additional information. And guess what? When they start drawing this stuff out, you see where more details come to them. They start realizing things that they may have missed. And so it's not only helpful for me, but I've contributed in some way. When I go into the product meetings, hey, I don't have a lot of time here. What do we want automated? I'm not going to be able to automate everything. Can you provide me with some statistics, some analytics on how our customers are using our product? What's most important? And what I'm doing is forcing a conversation where people need to identify what are the top priorities for our product. Where do we want to focus our attention? Where are the risk areas? And where are we willing to take a chance? And that's beneficial to not only me, but to the entire team. Last one. Adjust the measurement of success. So with the sale of the MP3s, we saw where the music industry had to reevaluate how they were measuring the success of a musician. No longer was it limited to just album sales, but they started looking at, hey, maybe we should track this other metric as well. As we're being asked to shift left, the metrics that we're being measured against have not necessarily shifted with us. If the intent of me shifting left is to identify areas and issues before they actually become bugs, why are you measuring me on how many bugs I find? Doesn't add up. There was a guy, best tester that I've ever known till this day. And he did a remarkable job of shifting left. He was able to walk into these meetings and he could identify problem areas before any code was ever written. He would say, let me hear the design. Nah, it's not going to work. It's going to break here, here, and there. Oh, you want to develop this new feature? Well, with that, here are some issues you have not thought of that our customers are sure to run into. You want to integrate with this third-party application. Not like that, you won't. This won't work because of X, Y, and Z. Remarkable tester. It got to the point where they no longer needed to remember to invite him to these meetings. They didn't want to have the meeting if this guy couldn't come. He provided that much value. But because he was finding these things very early in the process, he didn't have a lot of bugs. But that was the metric. And so when review time came and he was being compared to his peers, and they had more bugs than he did, they got better ratings than he did. This guy eventually lost his job. Best tester I've ever known. As our industry is changing, as our value and our position are questioned, we have to find ways to remain relevant and to own the narrative. And I know that it could feel hopeless at times. Studying the history of how others have failed and succeeded helps me to stay encouraged, and it gives me perspective on ways to move forward. So while there are changes all around us, and things will continue to change, it's imperative that we remember our role is not one of those things. As we navigate these changes, let's look for opportunities to own our narrative.